Chapter 12, Intelligence. On Wednesday morning at the end of homeroom, Mrs. Noyes called me up to her desk. "Nora, Mrs. Byrne wants you to bring all your overdue books back to the library before noon." I said, "But nothing's overdue." Mrs. Noyes said, "Well, you'll have to tell that to Mrs. Byrne." And then I understood the message. Mrs. Byrne didn't need to see me about overdue books. There was some other reason. And for the first time, it struck me how good it was to have someone else know the real me. And also how strange and new it felt to have someone else know that I wasn't normal. Then I thought of a good tongue twister. No more normal Nora. 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 5 times fast. All that ran through my mind in less than a second, so I nodded to Mrs. Noyes and said, "Okay, I'll go to the library right now." And I started to leave. Then Mrs. Noyes said, "Oh, and another thing, Nora, I saw Dr. Trindler in the teacher's room this morning. He wants you to come to his office again this afternoon during 5th period." I was halfway out of the door by then, so I just nodded and said, "5th period, okay." When I got to the library, Mrs. Byrne was busy checking out books for the 3rd grade class, but she caught my eye and motioned me over to the front desk. "Here, Nora," she handed me a stack of student name cards. "Would you sort these alphabetically, please?" I said, "Sure." There was another chair, but it was easier to sort the cards standing up. About 3 minutes later, all the 3rd graders were gone, but Mrs. Byrne was still busy. Without taking her eyes off the computer screen, she said, "That test, the one you took yesterday with Dr. Trindler, what was that like?" "Kind of fun," I said. "It was an IQ test. First time I've ever had a test like that." Mrs. Byrne kept tapping on her keyboard. "And how do you think you did?" she asked. I said, "Well, I tried to get about 3 things wrong out of every 10. It was all I could figure out to do. I was trying to get about 70% right. You know, about average." Mrs. Byrne said, "I see." She started sorting through some papers, but her hands were all jerky and nervous. Then she stopped and looked me right in the eye. "I found something out this morning. The test you took was scaled for children up to 16 and a half years old. Your score translated to an IQ of 117, and that's above average." I interrupted and said, "That's not really a big problem, is it? I mean, tests like this aren't always right, are they?" Mrs. Byrne said, "There is more to it than that. 117? That's what your IQ would be if you were 16 years old. But since you're only 11, your score translated to a higher IQ, much higher. According to that test, you have an IQ of 188. That's way up near the top of the scale. And Dr. Trindler doesn't know what to think." My legs felt a little weak. I sat down. What else did Dr. Trindler say to you?" Mrs. Byrne shook her head. "He didn't tell me anything at all. He hasn't talked about this to anyone but his assistant, Mrs. Drummond. The only reason I know is because Mrs. Drummond's car is in the shop. We live near each other, so I drove her to school today, and she was bursting to tell someone. Dr. Trindler said your IQ contradicts your whole academic record. So he thinks the test must be wrong." Mrs. Byrne stopped talking and pressed her lips together into a frown. She said, "I know I shouldn't be telling you this, Nora, but I couldn't help it." "I won't tell anyone you told me." She smiled. "I know that, Nora. That's not what I'm worried about. You're getting yourself into a tricky situation here. I don't want you to get hurt, and I don't want anyone to get hurt." We were both quiet. Then Mrs. Byrne said, "So what do you think you'll do?" I shrugged and tried to smile a little. I'll have to see what Dr. Trindler says. I have to go there again for 5th period. Mrs. Burns said, he could be planning another test for today. I stood up and said, well, I won't know until I get there. And right now, I guess I'd better get to art class. May I have a pass? Of course you may, she said. Then she gave me a big smile, a real one, and said, I don't think I would have ever been brave enough to try something like this when I was a girl, Nora. Even now, I think I'm more worried than you are. I smiled back. Don't be worried. Tests and grades don't matter that much. Remember? Mrs. Byrne laughed and said, that's right. I'm sure there's nothing to worry about. She handed me the pass and I said, thanks, Mrs. Byrne. And I didn't mean just for the pass, and she knew that. And she said, you're so welcome, Nora.